Hey everybody, welcome to Trading Capital Exclusive Analysis. In today's video, we're discussing the S&P 500 and the long-awaited final mega cap company set to report earnings tomorrow, NVIDIA. Overall, the weekly chart of the S&P 500 finally bubbling up into this little bit of a double top pivot and this down-sloping trend line that everybody is watching. The SPX is now trading at 45.47 after it was all the way down at the 4100 level just at the beginning of October. So in less than a month, we have rallied over 400 points on the S&P 500. I mean, even this magnificent rally had a pullback. Even some of these terrific bear market bounce lows where you had huge consecutive days in a row ended up having pullbacks. Huge rallies ended up in pullbacks. Big rallies had consolidation in between. We have gone virtually straight up into this resistance right ahead of the FOMC minutes tomorrow. Do we think Powell is going to like the fact that markets have rallied substantially? I think not. Inflation is still not at their target yet, and stocks are taking full advantage of potentially a dovish Fed looking to pause and pivot. So S&P is tagging the mother of all trend lines as we speak. Let's see what the VIX is doing. So with this move up, look at the VIX. The VIX is slowly creating what looks to be a potentially vicious. Let me just erase some of these trend lines just so we can see it clearly. But the VIX is putting in a potential falling wedge pattern. If you lose that pivot to these pivots, you can see that it's testing the break of this wedge pattern. Maybe it needs to hit double bottom, but the VIX at 13.42, one has to start questioning, is the VIX going to get a bounce? Are the indices going to sell off? Time will tell, but pay close attention to that VIX and S&P relationship because this is starting to consolidate in a little bit of a falling wedge pattern. And technically speaking, falling wedge patterns often lead to bullish moves to the upside. All right, let's talk about NVIDIA, NVDA. We have a massive trend line, and NVIDIA is still pumping in the after hours here, making new after or pre-market, post-market highs at 504, 505 now in the post-market. So after hours prints are coming in, but NVIDIA is still climbing here. Couple resistance trend lines to watch. So we have the all-time parallel channel that we have been watching. You can see that there's maybe a little bit more upside to the 515, 516 area. Okay, well then you zoom out and you take the major pivot set in 2021, you connect it to the previous all-time high, and you can see that maybe there's upside to 524. Now, the options market is implying a very big move one way or another. One way or another, we're going to get a big move. Since there's major resistance points up ahead, close ahead, in my opinion, the risk to reward certainly favors the downside from this point. And if you look at the valuations, I mean, okay, you look at where NVIDIA really started to get going here. So here was that big gap up that caught a lot of people off sides. And basically the NVIDIA expectations were for an estimate of $6.5 billion in revenue, and they reported 7.19. So it was really a 10% surprise in revenue to the upside that led to that massive, I believe it was a 25+% gap up to the high side. And then NVIDIA really never just looked back after that. Then we go to the next earnings report, and you can see that the estimate was 11.19 billion. And that beat estimates by 20.7%. They reported 13.5 billion. So you went from basically a 7.19 reported revenue all the way to a 13.5. That is a massive jump. And then look at the beat. When you beat substantially on the estimates by 20%, look at the reaction. You know, you had that initial move up here, big gap up, and the gap up was just absolutely faded, and you had a little bit of lower price action, a retest of that area, and then markets just slammed NVIDIA back down. So even after a massive 20% beat on earnings, NVIDIA price action had that gap up and it was faded. So just be careful. We could see something similar. If NVIDIA, let's say NVIDIA hypothetically beats, we could see a very similar price action where it gaps up and then it gets slammed back down to the downside. So absolutely, full disclosure, I'm starting to nibble on some semiconductor shorts, Nvidia one of them included. It's super, super risky, but needless to say, if it pumps up into this position, you got to have maneuverability and room to dollar cost average just in case it does creep up. Now, what are the earnings expectations? Well, last earnings, they reported 13.5 billion. This earnings, the estimate is 16.2 billion. So an additional 20% more from the previous earnings report. So we're at the scenario where can Nvidia now quarter over quarter grow its revenue by an additional 20%? That's what we're going to find out come tomorrow after the bell. It's certainly going to be a wild one because everything is hinging on the semiconductors. Nvidia could single-handedly make or break this market, but again, I still think even if they do come in better than expected and get a pop, I think that pop is likely going to be fatal. Look at the SOXX, still trying to push for this 535 gap fill. It has not done so yet, but a massive, massive move to the high side. Look at Microsoft. Microsoft also making a new all-time high. I mean, we have to go back on the charts just to see these resistance points. It's absolutely crazy some of the moves that this stock is making. You can see that Microsoft is potentially coming up into this trend line. Let me just erase this parallel channel here, just so it's easier for easy for viewing. But if you take the low here in COVID and you draw it all the way through where you got rejected at this pivot, made new lows, you draw it through these two massive wick candles. Microsoft is basically bubbling up right into that trend line. It's getting a full-on retrace of that weekly distribution doji that we got last week. You can see that the current price action is above this resistance trend line, but there's so much resistance up here. 4 weeks of consecutive upside in a multi-trillion-dollar name, regardless of this open AI news and Steve Altman being hired or not hired. It's still a big move that likely will yield to some consolidation, if not lower price action. And historically speaking, I mean, Microsoft's PE, price to sales, price to earnings, is just remarkably high right now at these lofty levels. And just pay attention to this huge volume candle that happened today, traded over 51 million shares. So the actual S&P was extremely light in volume today, only trading 69 million shares, as opposed to Microsoft basically trading 51 million shares by itself. So massive level, so to speak, that you have to really be cautious with as we approach these levels. But all eyes on Nvidia tomorrow. In terms of other sympathy plays, I have my semiconductor list that I will be watching for sympathy trades both on the long and the short side. So just to look at some of the names that I'm watching here, basically you have Okta, Ambarella, AMD's a big one into huge resistance at this point in time. Don't hold a position, but looking at it very closely. Qualcomm, Taiwan Semiconductors. Look at these moves on Qualcomm. It's Taiwan, TSM, also another outperformer as of recently over the last couple of weeks. Skyworks is one. Intel's one that's just gone absolutely parabolic in my opinion as well. Look at that move, testing major resistance points as well. You have Lam Research, NXPI, SMCI. Pay close attention to SMCI because again, SMCI was the closest semiconductor stock that was tracking Nvidia, and then off of its earnings report, it started getting slaughtered to the downside because even though it did beat by about 0.5% there, 4% on the actual earnings side, it started to falter and it's diverged from Nvidia quite drastically. Nvidia is making new all-time highs. SMCI has not. So SMCI was the one that was tracking Nvidia closely, and being the fact that SMCI is not basically following Nvidia like it was, leads me to be a little bit suspicious. You have AVGO, which is another powerhouse stock in the SMH indices, breaking out to new all-time highs, really tagging some critical resistance. So all of these semiconductor names are overbought and hitting major resistance. So if Nvidia misses or the reaction isn't taken kindly, you just better be careful because semiconductors could weigh in on this market. And I do think even if they do get a pop, we will likely see it faded over the next couple weeks or so. On that note, please give this video a big like down below. And if you're interested to see how I'm trading it, you can check out our YouTube Premium membership, as well as my memberships at tradingcapital.ca. Take care, everybody. I'll see you on the charts a bit later.